Welcome to True Echo, the home of untold truths and unforgettable voices. Today's story takes us beyond applause, beyond performance, into the soul of a young girl who had nothing, no name, no mentor, no applause, just her music. When she walked barefoot onto one of the world's most prestigious stages, the judges whispered, "Is she even supposed to be here?" But what Lena Halberg played left them stunned, silent, and forever changed. This is a story of survival, of heartbreak, of a truth so powerful it didn't need words, only keys. The stage lights were unforgiving. They bathed everything in a golden glare that left no room for hesitation, no place to hide. Contestant 14, Lena Halberg, stepped forward, barefoot, cardigan rumpled, braid uneven, skirt slightly too long. The judges had already decided, she didn't belong. One muttered, "Is she lost?" Another scoffed, scribbling, "No stage presence," on their clipboard. Lena didn't hear them. Or maybe she did, but she'd grown used to the sound of dismissal. She approached the grand piano like someone greeting an old friend, hesitant, reverent. When she sat, the room fell still. No one expected what happened next. Lena didn't begin with a flourish or dramatic flair. She sat in silence, fingers trembling above the keys. Someone coughed. A woman in the second row checked her watch. Then it came, a single note, deep and raw, more memory than music. It struck the hall like lightning in slow motion. Another note followed, and another. It was hesitant, fragile. But as it continued, a melody began to emerge, not a famous concerto or technical display, but something more intimate, more haunting. Her hands told a story without words, a story of loss, of fire, of nights in a forgotten orphanage where silence screamed louder than voices. The judges leaned in. Pens stopped. Cameras refocused. A boy backstage dropped his practice book. "She's playing her own composition," someone whispered. But no one stopped her. They couldn't. Because the truth she played was stronger than anything they'd prepared for. As the final note of her performance hung suspended in the silence, the hall seemed to forget how to breathe. Lena didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply stood, placed her hands gently at her sides, and walked off stage the same way she had entered, softly, almost like a question. But what she left behind was not forgettable. It was something raw, unfiltered. It echoed in the bones of the judges and the audience alike, like a wound reopened in a room full of people who hadn't realized they were bleeding. Backstage, the atmosphere had shifted. Contestants who had once scoffed now stared wordlessly. A few turned away, embarrassed. Others looked at Lena like they'd seen a ghost, or something far more human than they had expected to encounter here. Lena didn't look at any of them. She sat quietly beside a vending machine, her fingers twitching like they still had something more to say, something trapped beneath her skin. She wasn't thinking about scores or applause. She wasn't even sure she'd done the right thing. She only knew that she had told the truth, and it had taken everything out of her. Meanwhile, in the judges' chamber, chaos reigned, but not the loud kind. It was the type of chaos born of stunned realization. One judge paced, muttering, "That wasn't on the program. She didn't submit this piece. She has no credentials." Another, older and more reserved, simply sat back and whispered, "That was not performance. That was confession." The room buzzed with questions. Who was she? How had she been allowed in? Was this a fluke or something far greater? A woman in a headset approached Lena gently. "Miss Halberg, the judges, they'd like to speak with you." Lena blinked up at her. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she was in trouble or being honored. Her entire life had taught her not to expect welcome. Still, she nodded. She followed the woman down a quiet hallway lit with golden sconces, her footsteps echoing faintly behind her. She walked as though through a dream, her shoulders squared, but her heart still trembling. Inside the judge's chamber, the mood had shifted from skepticism to awe. When Lena entered, all conversation stopped. She didn't know where to look. She stood in the center of the room, a wisp of a girl in a cardigan too thin for the season, her braids slipping slightly over her shoulder. The oldest judge finally spoke. "What you just did out there," he paused, searching for words that didn't feel small. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Lena's voice, long and used to being invited into rooms like this, came out soft. "At the orphanage. I fixed the piano. No one taught me. I just listened." "To whom?" another judge asked, leaning in with real curiosity. She looked down at her fingers. "To myself. To what hurt and what didn't." There was a long silence. The woman judge leaned forward. "And the piece? That was yours?" Lena nodded. "Do you have more?" the woman asked, her voice not professional now, but personal, almost pleading. I have notebooks," Lena said. "I write them when I can't sleep." And suddenly, that was it. The moment. The shift. No longer a girl without a name. No longer, contestant 14. Now she was a composer. A storyteller. A survivor whose music had done what no resume or reference could, it had made them all feel something they didn't even know they'd forgotten. The oldest judge stood slowly and walked toward her. "In all my years," he said, "I've heard genius. I've heard perfection. But I have never heard honesty like that." He paused. "You didn't just play music. You told the truth." Lena's throat tightened. It wasn't pride she felt. It was grief. Being seen, finally seen, was heavier than she'd imagined. He looked her directly in the eyes. "What do you want to do next?" For a moment, she didn't answer. She had never had the luxury of a next. Her life had been about survival, not vision. But then, with her eyes steady and voice almost a whisper, she replied, "I want to keep playing. For the ones who feel like they can't." That was the moment every judge at the table realized something else. This wasn't just a prodigy. This wasn't just a rare talent. This was a voice the world needed. That night, while the rest of the contestants attended the after-party, Lena walked alone through the city to a youth hostel where she'd paid for just one night's stay. Her funds were gone. Her future was uncertain. But in her bag was her notebook, filled with pieces no one had heard yet. And in her chest was a heart that had finally been acknowledged. She sat cross-legged on the bed, the buzz of the street outside muffled by thin curtains. Then, with a cheap pen and paper rough from too much use, she began writing a melody she hadn't yet named. It wasn't for a stage. It wasn't for acclaim. It was for healing. And what Lena didn't know, not yet, was that a grainy video clip of her performance had already been uploaded by someone in the third row. No fancy angles. No fancy audio. Just shaky hands and a single caption. She didn't say a word. But she said everything. The video spread slowly at first. No ads. No promotion. Just a whisper in the digital wind, shared from one trembling heart to another. It was filmed on an old phone by a teenager who didn't even know Lena's name, only that something in her playing had made her cry, really cry. The kind of tears that don't come from sadness, but from recognition. From memory. From something buried coming to the surface. By morning, the clip had crossed 80,000 views. By noon, 1 million. Comments began to flood in, not from music critics, but from ordinary people, nurses, factory workers, single parents, veterans, teenagers in dark rooms, writing things like, "I haven't touched a piano in 20 years. I'm playing again today." Or, "She plays like she's pouring her memories into the keys." But Lena didn't know any of this. Her phone was still powered off, the corner cracked from years of drops and hand-me-downs. She hadn't expected anyone to notice, let alone record her. She had come to the competition not to win, but to prove, if only to herself, that she existed. At dawn, she woke before the hostel's lights flicked on. She gathered her few belongings, laced up her worn flats, and walked to the train station. She hadn't bought a return ticket because she never thought she'd need one. Her plan had always been to go back to the orphanage, back to the basement piano with its warped middle keys, back to the kids who still wore extra sweaters at night when the heat didn't work. But fate had other plans. Just as Lena stepped onto the platform, a hand grabbed her shoulder. She turned, startled. A woman stood there, breathless, her coat flapping open and a lanyard around her neck that read, New York Philharmonic Fellowship Coordinator. She held up a phone in her other hand. Are you Lena Halberg? She asked, her voice thick with disbelief and relief. Lena hesitated, then nodded. Thank God, the woman exhaled. I've been to 3 hostels. You're not answering your phone. We've been trying to reach you since last night. The woman thrust the phone screen toward her. Lena blinked. There she was. Her face, frozen mid-performance, on every platform imaginable. Headlines screamed across the screen, Silent Girl's piano performance moves millions, Orphan Pianist redefines emotion in music, who is Lena Halberg? The mystery musician the world can't stop talking about. She stepped back instinctively, overwhelmed. The noise inside her head rose like a wave. The woman touched her arm, gently this time. Come. You don't have to do anything yet. Just, come. They drove through the city in silence. Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching skyscrapers blur by. She had never been inside a building taller than 5 stories. Now she was being driven to one where some of the world's most powerful names in classical music were waiting to meet her. And none of them had the faintest idea who she really was. At the art center, they led her through gleaming marble halls and glass-walled studios. People whispered when she passed. Some smiled nervously. Others just stared. Lena kept her eyes down. She wasn't used to being seen, at least, not like this. In a quiet studio room, a grand piano stood waiting, its surface polished to a mirror finish. Lena approached it cautiously, her hand brushing along its edge. The room was too clean, too bright. It didn't smell like dust or wood glue. It smelled like money. Like expectation. Then the door opened. A woman in her 60s entered, tall, elegant, with a streak of gray in her dark hair and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She introduced herself simply as Isabel Crane, concert pianist, international judge, and founder of a private scholarship for raw, untrained talent. She didn't sit. She folded her arms gently and studied Lena the way a sculptor studies a block of marble. I've waited 40 years to hear someone play like that again, she said. Lena didn't answer. Isabel stepped closer. Do you understand what you did? That wasn't just pain. That wasn't just technique. That was truth. Lena's eyes burned, but she said nothing. I don't want to make you famous, Isabel said. I want to protect what you already are. Lena finally looked up. Why? Isabel answered with a softness that could break granite. Because the world is full of noise. But people like you bring silence. The kind that makes people feel again. She gestured toward the piano. Would you play something? Lena hesitated. I don't have anything prepared. That's what makes you special. So Lena sat. She closed her eyes. And once more, she let her fingers find the truth hiding in the spaces between sound. The melody she played wasn't fiery or flawless. It was gentle, like waking up before the sun rises, when the air is still and the world hasn't yet remembered its pain. Outside the glass walls, a group of donors, composers, and foundation members stood, listening with their hands over their mouths. When she finished, Isabel didn't clap. She just stepped forward and said, You're not going back to the orphanage. At least not until we help you do what you were born to do. Lena's throat closed around something unspeakable. But that piano, she whispered, it's all they have. Then we'll send them another, Isabel said. And more. That night, Lena didn't return to the hostel. She stayed in a small conservatory suite overlooking the city skyline, her worn notebook beside her, her fingers aching in the most beautiful way. And though the world outside was now screaming her name, on screens, in blogs, in orchestra halls, inside her heart, there was still silence. But this time, it wasn't loneliness. It was beginning. Lena woke the next morning to rain tapping softly against the window. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded attention, it was the kind that whispered, gently, wrapping the city in a quiet hush. She sat at the edge of the conservatory suite's bed, her bare feet on the cold tile floor, a cup of untouched tea in her hands. The events of the last 24 hours hadn't quite settled in. She didn't feel famous. She didn't feel different. She only felt exposed. Her notebook lay beside her on the blanket, unopened. It felt heavier than usual, not because of the paper inside, but because of what it had come to represent. Her entire life had been poured into those worn pages, grief, longing, the ache of being overlooked. Now, the world had seen a glimpse of it, and she wasn't sure she was ready for them to keep looking. There was a gentle knock on the door. She opened it to find Isabel Crane standing there again, this time holding an umbrella in one hand and a bundled cloth in the other. "I thought you might want to see something," Isabel said. Her voice, like always, sounded like a cello playing under moonlight, calm, resonant, impossibly human. Lena slipped on her cardigan and followed. They didn't speak as they moved through the conservatory halls, descending marble staircases, passing through corridors where the faint sound of violin scales floated like incense. Eventually, they stepped outside, into the rain, following a cobblestone path behind the building. At the far end stood a glass pavilion, small, almost hidden by the trees. Inside, under a rain-streaked skylight, sat a single piano. It wasn't gleaming. It wasn't perfect. The wood was aged, the keys slightly worn, the bench a little crooked. But it was beautiful in its imperfection. Isabel held the door open. "It's yours," she said simply. "No stage. No audience. Just you." Lena stepped inside. The scent of old mahogany and wet stone embraced her like an old friend. She ran her fingers along the rim of the piano, pausing when she felt a small chip in the varnish. It reminded her of the piano in the orphanage, fragile, but full of stories. She sat. For a long time, she didn't play. She just let the silence breathe around her, let the presence of the instrument sink into her skin. Then, without thinking, she placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't even a song. It was a conversation, between her and the piano, between her past and her present. The notes came softly, like rain against the roof, like memories slipping in through cracks in the walls. And Isabel sat at the edge of the room, her eyes closed, listening. When it was over, she whispered, "I feel like I can breathe again." Lena didn't reply. She didn't need to. Later that day, Isabel introduced her to a small group of students at the conservatory. Not the prodigies with polished resumes and stage parents. These were the quiet ones. The ones with night jobs. The ones who practiced in stairwells and tuned their second-hand instruments with hope instead of precision. Tomas worked in the cafeteria. Ria studied theory in secret because her scholarship didn't include performance. They had all seen Lena's video. When she entered, none of them spoke. It wasn't the silence of awe. It was recognition. It was reverence. "How did you know how to put pain into music?" Tomas asked. Lena hesitated. "I didn't know. I just couldn't keep it inside anymore." Ria looked up. "When I play, I try to sound good. But when you played, it didn't feel like you were trying at all. It felt like you just were." Lena offered the faintest smile. That afternoon, they gathered in the empty auditorium and shared their secret compositions, the scribbles in margins, the melodies hummed into phone recorders at 2 a.m. Lena played a new piece too, one born in the rain-drenched pavilion just hours before. It had no name, just a feeling. Later that night, Lena wandered through the conservatory halls alone. Most rooms were dark now, the city outside flickering with neon life. But one door had been left slightly ajar, the recording studio. Curious, she stepped inside. The room was still and waiting, a red light blinking on the console. The piano stood in the center, untouched. She sat. No one was watching. No one was expecting. And so, she pressed the red button and began to play. This piece wasn't rehearsed. It came from somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere quieter than pain. It was a tribute. A farewell. A beginning. When she finished, she saved the file under a name that wasn't hers. For those who've never been heard. She didn't tell anyone about it. She didn't need to. 2 days later, Isabel found the recording on the server. She sat alone in her office, listening with her hand over her mouth. Then she forwarded the track to a small recording label that specialized in unpolished brilliance and wrote one line. "This girl isn't trying to be a star. She already is, just not in the way the world usually sees." Within hours, they reached out, asking if Lena would record a full album. Lena said yes, but only under one condition. It had to be dedicated to the unheard. To the children with broken instruments and silent rooms. To those who had always been told to stay small. And so, the album began. Not with fire. Not with fame. But with a whisper. The title of the album came to Lena in the early hours of a sleepless night, her notebook balanced on her knees as she sat in the window alcove of the conservatory suite. Outside, the city blinked and shifted beneath a shroud of fog. The title wasn't something grand or poetic, it was honest. It was what the music had always been for her. The ones who waited in silence. She wrote it down in tiny script at the top of a fresh page and stared at it for a long time. That was who she was writing for, not critics, not patrons, not even the judges who had changed her life with a single invitation. She was writing for the children still curled up in threadbare beds, afraid to speak. She was writing for herself, the girl who had once pressed her ear to the broken keys of a basement piano and pretended the creaks and twangs were melodies no one else could hear. The studio where she recorded the album wasn't grand. It was tucked away in the city's arts district, its floors scuffed, its walls lined with cracked acoustic panels. But it was quiet, and Lena liked it that way. She would arrive just after sunrise, long before the engineers or producers showed up. She needed the silence to find her starting point. She recorded alone. No producers hovering behind glass. No metronome ticking like a scolding teacher. Just her, a worn piano, and the things she still hadn't found words for. Each track was named after something small: Eli's Lullaby, The Red Scarf Waltz, Windows in Winter. Each one carried a memory. A face. A feeling. She didn't aim for perfection, only truth. And when the sessions were over, she would slip out quietly, unnoticed, like a shadow returning to its corner. The album released with little fanfare. No billboards. No interviews. Just a simple upload to streaming services, a small post from the label, and a single sentence in the artist description. Every note here was once a whisper in a room no one entered. If you are reading this, you are not alone. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to. It spread like candlelight, small, persistent, unstoppable. Music teachers shared it with anxious students. Hospice workers played it during moments of farewell. Therapists streamed it for clients who couldn't yet speak. Letters began to arrive. Hundreds, then thousands. Most were handwritten, folded between drawings or photographs, scrawled on napkins, torn from diaries. Many began the same way. I thought I was invisible, until I heard this. She read every one. Some made her cry. Others made her sit in stillness for hours. One, from a child in foster care, simply read, "I want to be brave like your music." Another, from a widowed grandfather, said, "I haven't listened to music since my wife passed." Yours made me sit by her picture and smile for the first time in 5 years. Lena kept the letters stacked near her window in a set of shoeboxes. She didn't reply to all of them, she couldn't, but she began writing pieces in response. Not public ones. Private ones. Melodies meant for one pair of ears only. Sometimes she sent them back as sheet music, scribbled with pencil notations and a short note, "This is for your sister. Play it when you think of her." Other times, she recorded short audio clips and sent them directly. The world had begun to call her something new. The quiet flame. She didn't like it. She didn't dislike it either. It just wasn't her. What she did cherish was something else entirely, walking back into the orphanage after her album's release. The halls looked the same. Faded linoleum. Dusty vents. Peeling paint around the baseboards. But the music room, oh, the music room had changed. There was color now. Curtains hung neatly from the window. The walls were covered in crayon art and clipped sheet music. Bean bags dotted the corners. And in the center stood a beautiful upright Steinway, gifted anonymously. The ribbon still tied around its legs. The children ran to her when she arrived. Eli was first, his arms tight around her waist. "You came back," he whispered. "I promised I would," she said, tears already blurring her vision. She spent the next few days teaching them, not just scales or posture or theory, but listening. Listening to themselves. She showed them how to build 4-note songs. How to hear a melody before touching a key. How to write about what hurt without using words. One afternoon, they asked her to play the piece that had made her famous, as Eli put it. She hesitated. Then she sat at the piano, still wearing her coat, boots still muddy from the walk up the hill. She played it, not for applause, but for them. This version was slower. Gentler. More intimate. She adjusted the pacing instinctively, watching their faces as they listened, catching each reaction like a conductor with invisible strings. And when she played the final note, they didn't clap. They hugged her. All of them. A pile of warmth and limbs and laughter tangled in her cardigan, their joy pressed into her skin like sunlight. Later that week, a man arrived at the orphanage. A music producer who had heard rumors of Lena's return. He brought offers, tours, interviews, branded merchandise, a potential memoir. Lena listened carefully, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. When he finished his pitch, she said 3 simple words. Not just yet. He didn't understand. But he didn't push. Because he'd seen the fire in her eyes when she looked at the children. It wasn't the fire of ambition. It was the fire of purpose. That spring, Lena agreed to one thing only, a new project. Not an album. Not a tour. A collection of songs written with the children. She called it, Songs for the Unseen. And on the back cover, she insisted they print just one line. We weren't silent. We were waiting. Spring bloomed slowly across the hills surrounding the orphanage, melting the frost from the grass and turning puddles of gray snow into streams of light. The music room buzzed with laughter, missed notes, and the clatter of pencils on staff paper. Lena had begun work on her next project, a children's choir. But not the traditional kind, no uniforms, no rigid harmonies. These children sang in tones rough and raw, notes that cracked, wavered, and sometimes trembled. But they were real. That's what mattered. She called it the choir of the unheard. They didn't practice scales. They practiced presence. Each rehearsal began with silence, just a minute. No one was allowed to speak or hum. Instead, Lena asked them to listen, to their hearts, to the room, to the wind brushing the glass. Then, they would begin. She wrote original compositions for them, each one inspired by their stories. One piece opened with only a single line, whispered by a soft voice, "I thought no one knew I existed." Another incorporated laughter and the creaking of an old door that had once frightened a younger child until Lena told him it sounded like a cello stretching awake. Their first performance was in the orphanage's garden pavilion. Folding chairs were borrowed from the church. Plastic cups of lemonade sat sweating in the sun. Townspeople came, unsure of what to expect. Some had only heard of Lena from whispers and newspaper clippings. Others remembered her as the quiet girl who once walked barefoot to school even in the snow. The choir stood in a lopsided line. Some fidgeted. One had forgotten to wear shoes. Lena stood beside them, not in front. She wasn't their conductor. She was their echo. When the music began, it wasn't in harmony. It was in feeling. A single hum. Then a fragile chord. Then voices, one by one, sharing lines not from scripts but from real lives. By the time they reached the final piece, the room where I sat alone, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. That song began with 12 seconds of absolute silence. Then a whisper, "I thought I didn't matter. But then I made a sound." And in that moment, the entire audience realized, they weren't watching a performance. They were witnessing healing. The next day, a write-up appeared in the local paper. It wasn't flashy. No big headlines. Just a modest review written by a man in a flannel coat, who had grown up in the same orphanage 30 years earlier. He ended his piece with the line. "She gave them mirror songs. Pieces that didn't ask for perfection but gave permission to exist." Lena read it aloud to the children at lunch. When she finished, they clapped, not for themselves, but for the man who had written it. Eli even stood on his chair and yelled, "Come to our next concert." Not long after, Lena received a call from a documentary film team. They had seen footage of the choir's performance and wanted to follow her process. They wanted to record the children's growth, the evolution of Lena's music, and the way her story was rewriting how people viewed classical performance. She thought about it. Then she said, "You can film me, but only if you also film them." And so, The Girl Who Played Silence began production. The film crew was respectful. They didn't interrupt rehearsals or stage anything fake. They simply observed, children learning to write their first four-note melodies, Lena stitching together a lullaby from a child's humming, the moment one girl cried quietly while singing and the rest of the choir reached for her hand without hesitation. They captured Lena's late nights in the conservatory studio, where she still returned once a week. There, she recorded alone, often under soft amber light, letting each week's emotions find their way into new compositions. Some of the recordings she kept. Others, she erased. But a few, just a few, she sent to the documentary team, asking that they be included in the final cut. The documentary aired 6 months later. It wasn't released in theaters. It premiered online. Quietly. No press tour. No morning shows. Just a YouTube upload with a black thumbnail and white letters that read, "Sometimes the quietest voice is the loudest truth." And something happened. Nursing homes played it in their rec rooms. Music schools screened it for incoming students. Parents watched it with their children. Teachers played it during the last day of class, wiping their eyes when they thought no one was looking. Survivors of all kinds wrote in, sharing how Lena's journey had mirrored their own. Not note for note, but feeling for feeling. At the orphanage, the children watched it in the dining room, projected onto a wrinkled sheet pinned to the wall. They sat on blankets, holding cocoa, their hearts thudding with pride. When it ended, Lena stood in the back, unsure of what to say. Eli turned to her and asked, "Do they know now?" She looked at him, puzzled. "Know what?" He grinned. "That we're real." She knelt down and kissed the top of his head. "I think they do." The next day, the documentary's closing song, "We Were Never Broken," began charting on classical playlists across streaming platforms. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. It was a choral piece written in simple three-part harmony, sung by children who had once believed their voices didn't matter. It ended with the same whisper Lena had begun years ago on that distant competition stage. We were music becoming sound. And across the world, people listened. Winter returned to the hillside town not with fanfare but with a hush, snow resting like a memory on rooftops, bare branches brushing at the sky. The garden pavilion stood shrouded in white, the piano inside protected beneath its wool covering. Children's boots crunched along the walkways as Lena Halberg sat on the back steps of the orphanage, a thick shawl draped over her shoulders, steam rising from a chipped mug in her hands. She wasn't writing music today. Not yet. In her lap was a photograph. It had arrived in the mail 3 days earlier, tucked between parchment sheets and bound with twine. The image captured Lena from behind, seated at the piano in the pavilion, sunlight streaming through the skylight, her fingers hovering above the keys. There were no faces in the frame. No audience. Just her. Just the moment. Attached was a handwritten note in looping, deliberate script. You taught them how to hear again. And in doing so, taught me how to forgive the silence in my own life. A.V. Alden Varelli. The reclusive composer. The one whose invitation had once changed her life. She smiled without tears, because this time, she didn't need them. Silence no longer hurt. It simply was. More invitations had come since the release of the documentary, Carnegie Hall, Paris Philharmonic, Tokyo Symphony. Even a film score contract. Lena said no to most of them. Not because she was afraid, or ungrateful, but because she was still listening. Still waiting to hear what her own heart needed to say next. Sometimes that meant sitting on the floor of the orphanage dining room, helping a 6-year-old rhyme moon with spoon in their very first song. Other times, it meant walking into town to leave a piano etude on the doorstep of an elderly woman who had once taught music before arthritis took her hands. But then, one letter arrived that she could not ignore. The envelope was thick, the handwriting almost calligraphic. It came from Vienna, the Royal Conservatory. Inside, a formal invitation. They wanted her to premiere an original concerto at the International Composer Symposium. Isabel, now retired and living in a quiet cottage near the conservatory, came to visit Lena when she received the news. The older woman didn't pressure. She just placed a hand over Lena's and said, "The world is ready for more. Are you?" Lena looked out the window, at the children chasing snowflakes across the yard. She was no longer the girl who had to prove she existed. Now, she was someone learning how to shape that existence into something lasting. "I think I'm finally ready too," she whispered. When she arrived in Vienna months later, the contrast was stark. Marble columns, chandeliers, gowns, velvet seats, and an audience dressed in formality and expectation. But Lena still wore the same cardigan. She still carried the same worn notebook. And around her wrist, hidden under the sleeve of her coat, was the same rubber band bracelet the orphanage children had made her for luck. The hall was packed. Reporters, dignitaries, critics, fellow composers. She walked to the piano alone. And when she began to play, it was not with thunder or fireworks. It was with 5 notes. Soft. Hesitant. Honest. The concerto unfolded not as a display of technical prowess, but as a living memory. It was built from every child's whisper, every unsent letter, every night Lena had spent wondering if her voice mattered. In the middle of the second movement, an old man in the 3rd row wept silently. A young girl on the balcony sat forward, wide-eyed, still. A jaded music critic in the box closed her laptop and listened, tears streaking quietly down her cheek. By the final movement, Lena's hands barely touched the keys. The room held its breath. She ended with the same 5 notes. Older now. Changed. Whole. She stood and stepped back, not bowing, not smiling. Simply letting the truth speak for itself. And then, the applause. Not the kind given out of obligation. Not the kind meant for spectacle. This was different. People stood, not in triumph, but in reverence. They clapped not for a girl who had made it, but for a truth they had forgotten could exist in a world so loud. Backstage, Lena was handed a bouquet of white tulips and a small envelope. She didn't open it immediately. She didn't need to. Outside the window, the city of music blinked beneath twilight. And for the first time, she felt like she belonged in it, not because of a title or a review, but because she had created something that would outlive noise. Back at the orphanage, the children had gathered to watch a live stream projected onto a wrinkled sheet. They'd screamed when she appeared, clapped when she played, and cried when she walked off the stage. When she returned days later, dragging her suitcase up the same hill where her journey had begun, they ran to her. Eli asked, "Did they clap?" She knelt beside him. They didn't stop. That evening, she sat at the upright piano with her boots still on and played the Vienna Concerto for them, adjusted, softened, made real. When she finished, no one clapped. They just hugged her again. Every one of them. In the months that followed, Lena launched a small foundation with Isabel's help, the Silence Project, an initiative to bring instruments and songwriting workshops to orphanages and shelters around the world. They built studios in places where silence had once meant shame. And still, Lena continued writing. Her next suite would be for children's voices again. She titled it When No One Was Watching. But this time, the world would be. In a world obsessed with volume, perfection, and performance, Lena Halberg's journey reminds us that sometimes the quietest voices hold the most truth. She didn't become legendary by chasing applause, but by telling her truth through music, one trembling note at a time. As Lena once wrote, silence isn't emptiness. It's the place where healing begins. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about the moment in your life when silence taught you something powerful. And don't forget to subscribe to True Echo, where quiet stories speak the loudest truths.